In the immanence of truths, Badiou is doing something. Philosophy is a practice, and at the same time, in doing that, he's exemplifying something more general. So we can see his book and his system of thought as laying out a system of thought, but we can see him as constantly giving advice about how to proceed in philosophy and in life. So the first section of the introduction is called Speculative Strategy. He could equally have called it argumentative strategy. He calls it speculative strategy, as far as I'm concerned, to highlight the fact that the sort of argument that he is establishing is one based on speculation, on a speculative leap. So if you want, you could call that a form of hypothetico-deductive method, as opposed to induction. Induction goes from the given data, and then by assembling, accumulating, deducing, once you've got the given, and you've got by extrapolation, you've got generalizations. You can deduce consequences as well. But basically, empiricism, naive empiricism, and induction go together. That's the world of finitude, and that's the world of continuous commensurability. Everything you do and say will be commensurable with its context. Badiou is proposing a speculative leap. So it's not just a speculative generalization, it's a counter-inductive, counter-intuitive, counter-commensurable. It's an incommensurable leap into the most absolute, that is to say, the most generic, ideas or truths that you can come up with. How can we do that? Badiou does it in this book by appealing to the truths of mathematics. And we know he posits 4 truth procedures: maths or science, politics, love, and art. So we talked in the previous section about the question whether mathematics is heuristic, and so allowing for other trajectories, or a constraint that has hegemony over the other truth procedures. I think, as we shall see in this synthesis that I'm trying to operate now, the constraint belongs to the world of finitude. I talked in the previous section about how the universality of truth is not a universality of constraint, but of availability or accessibility. So in that case, we can make our leap on the basis of a passage through mathematics, and this passage, this becoming subject of certain truths in mathematics, means different things for different people. You don't have to be an expert in mathematics. You don't have to be a creator in mathematics. Just reading this book with full participation, full intellectual and affective participation, is a way of incorporating yourself into the mathematical truths and being a subject of those truths. But other truths are perhaps more available to you, and gasp might even give you different results to Badiou's results. So there's the artistic truth procedure, but we're not all called upon to be artists. There's the political truth procedure. We're all called on in some way or another to participate in politics, whether we like it or not. And fourthly, the procedure of love. So the procedure of love, sometimes Badiou talks about love as the two that can be exemplified in a conjugal couple. And sometimes he talks about love in terms of what is experienced within psychoanalysis. And I would say in other things as well, as long as there's this two, there's not a fusion and is not two separate atoms or egos. And that can be found in lots of places. We must never forget that Badiou is French. Surprise. He was born, I think, in 1938, and he had education within the French educational system. He went to École Normale Supérieure, and so he was exposed at the time of its flowering to Althusser and to Lacan. So when Badiou thinks of the truth procedure of love, he's going to think of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Well, we're in 2021, and we're in the English-speaking world. So despite people trying to import this sort of old influence into the English-speaking world and give it new life, new blood, which is a worthy procedure, that's not the only way to go. It was automatic. Anybody who was anybody intellectually in Badiou's time and place, that's the concrete part of the concrete universal, was a structuralist and a Lacanian. But today, anybody who is anybody does not need to be involved in Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis at all. That's just one tiny variation in huge, infinite truth procedure. So that's something that's accessible. The truths of love in the private and in the transformational practices of the two, that's available to anybody and can give you a participation in truths. Equal in value to the mathematicians who participate, even at a modest level, as we can by reading the book, or at a high level. And I'm emphasizing this because from the beginning, I want to avoid the mathematicist hegemony in reading this book. It's full of mathematics. And if you want to really read the book, you have to really read the mathematics, really go into it and participate as much as you can with your full intellect and affect in the mathematics of the book. But there's no reason to give primacy to the mathematical truth procedure. It's what was most available and perhaps most pedagogically available to Badiou over his 30-year period that he describes and in the writing of this book. But that's all it is. And I think the communism as the principle of equality starts there. No mathematicist hegemony over the so-called correct reading of this book. Badiou wants us to make this speculative leap in terms of the truths of which we are or can be subject. He sets up 4 characteristics of the truths: absolute, eternal, generic, and universal. So I have already talked about the idea that eternal and universal just means perpetually available and not permanently constraining. To sum up these notions, or these four trays, Badiou calls them concrete universal exceptions. So they're concrete, they're localized in time and space and within worlds, and that's where the constraint comes in. A world is a constraining configuration. They're universal, so they're trans-world, and I would say untimely, and they're exceptions. So that's the escape from constraint there. Truths are concrete universal exceptions. They're exceptions, they're anomalies. They're escaping from the constraints. So after talking about, starting with this extreme speculative leap, Badiou talks about possible ideological philosophizing. There's the onto-theological apparatus, and that has, once again, we're going to talk about authority. That has the formal authority of the infinite one. So it's a formal authority, whatever the formal means there. It may mean that it's a form that is open to many different contents according to the historical context. And it's an authority based on this fusion of the one and the infinite. So it's an absolute constraint. For Badiou, so far we're not talking about mathematics at all. And then he just sort of slides in one thing about, we can think one thing about mathematics. He says, in the wake of Cantor, we separate the infinite and the one. And we see that, we pose that existence, everything that exists, is in the form of the multiple without one. So at that level, you just need, that's already participating in mathematics. Just getting the idea and understanding it, the Cantorian idea that the one and the infinite are different things. You can have different sized infinities. The proof of that he's going to go into later, that the size of the infinity describing the real numbers is a higher size, a higher power than the size of the infinity describing the natural numbers, is a really easy proof to master, and it's quite impressive. I came across that proof when I was 10 or 11 years old. I read it in a book explaining modern mathematics, and I was just blown away. So that can be enough to set you on a philosophical path, a path of immanence and not of transcendence. So he warns against, after Cantor, after the death of God and so on, most of us, the world is anyhow. But the second danger is absolutization or de-absolutization, total de-absolutization. That's bad. It seems good at the beginning. It feels good. But it feels good because we, literally, because it's the central operation behind contemporary hedonism, but it leads to radical relativism, which is a form of a mask for skepticism. And it leads also to vague democratism. So what we need is a different orientation, which he calls the generic orientation, which is neither avoids the traps of the transcendent orientation and of the democratic materialist orientation. So that democratic materialist orientation says there are only bodies and languages. The absolute and the universal are dangerous concepts to be avoided. So as soon as you talk about the absolute and the universal, you're self-refuting. You're not to be taken seriously anymore. So here I want to draw a parallel with Laruelle that exists from the beginning, but it may not have been noticed. We said that Laruelle, like Badiou, begins with the absolute. And in Laruelle's terms, another way of saying that is he begins with the human. And in fact, this definition of truths at the very beginning as absolute, eternal, generic, and universal is already beginning with the human, because Badiou says very clearly in Logics of Worlds that under the constraints of democratic materialism, we're not human. It's the human animal, what Laruelle calls the android and the anthropoid. So that's the only humanity that can exist under the constraints of democratic materialism. So we're beginning with truths, we're beginning with the human as well, even if the truths are asubjective. They are creative processes of incorporation of the human as subject. So after that large tableau for a beginning, Badiou analyzes the enemy. The enemy, the current day ideology, we have a first approach, is democratic relativism. There are only bodies and languages and no truths. Now he's going to give a second analysis, a little more fine detailed. So that's the analysis that we saw of the triple hypostasis, I'm going to say. First, ontological. The finite is what is, and that puts realist constraints, so this term of constraint for finitude, on finitude. The second is, so we had what is, what can be, and that puts restrictions, the restriction of possibles, that is constraints on possibles. So that means everything that we might imagine that's different from our society and our way of thinking today is within the ideology of finitude. These alternatives are ideologies. Within the ideology of finitude, it itself is not an ideology, it's the end of ideology, and Anything different is ideology, imaginary, utopian, an illusion. So there's a constraint on the projection into the future and a constraint on the imagination. Don't imagine crazy things. You can extrapolate from what's going on now, but you can't speculate in a more radical sense of extrapolation. And third, so we have what is, what can be, and what must be. That's the third hypostasis. And what must be is what is. So there we have the short circuit between is and ought. Respect the status quo and its commensurable extrapolations into the future, and that's all. So that's another constraint. There's a normative constraint as well. So we have a realist constraint. We have what is in fact, so the realist constraint, the finite is what is. We have a noetic constraint. Don't think about or invent or imagine anything else. And we have a normative constraint. This is good. Stick with this. It's your duty. And that's the authority of the finite. So we have 1, 2, 3. What is, what can be, what must be. And the objections, the attempts to break out of the finitist trap, Badiou is going to consider in the opposite order. So he starts with 3, what must be, and that's the postmodern attempt to break out of the trap, which he finds exemplified in its best possible form by Lyotard. So Lyotard, in fact, is seeming to project something radical, but in a way it's a capitulation. So it's seeming to project something radical because it's projecting something else as a prescriptive instance with the postmodern condition, the abandon of the grand narratives. Lyotard is accepting ontological finitude. So he says science can go on, it will, and science and technology will complexify things more and more. It may or may not be infinite in the quantitative sense, but it's still in a certain sense finite, or because, and here he agrees with Badiou, it will be a weak infinite if it turned out to be infinite. But that is not for us to speculate on, that's for science to find out. So the only, so as well, in this path of complexification, there's it's too powerful. There's no room for Marxist revolution. Lyotard gave that up, and he just falls back on the infinite prescription, the authority of the infinite, and that's based on this, on separating as much as he can is and ought, which he finds fused together in the grand narratives. So it's a way out because it separates is and ought, and it's not onto-theological because he takes a lesson from Levinas, and their description and prescription is and ought are different language games, they're different regimes of phrases, and the ought the prescription is defined as a phrase that comes to us without any sender or enunciator. So the way out of for Lyotard out of ontotheology conceived as positive theology that tells us about the world and about the origin, God as the origin of the prescription, is reactive because God is barred, the sender or the enunciator of the prescription is barred, so it's a negative theology. And so for Badiou, it's a form of reaction. The second way out is within democratic materialism, and that's what we saw as the weak stretching of the finite. It's the finite is thinly stretched to make the infinite. So it's all flat, no more asperities because it's being stretched and stretched and stretched, and it's just sort of getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And the hope is that it won't, you won't go too far. It won't break or snap. That you can, by thinning things down, weakening things down, you can keep up social and intellectual and scientific and technological progress. So that's the attempt to find the infinite within the second hypostasis. And going back to the first hypostasis, that's the hard problem for Badiou, the ontological hypostasis, and that's where Badiou is hoping to intervene. So he's taking on the hard problem, and he thinks he solved it, and the hard problem has to be taken on head on, and that's why he emphasized on the first page this separation, this Cantor facilitated separation between the infinite and the one, to give us the concept of the multiple without one, because the hard problem is solved in saying that the finite does not exist. It's a result, but it has no ontological consistency in itself. The finite is always a result. The finite finally doesn't have any real existence. That said, the finite does have, within the ideology of finitude, two modes of existence. There's the finite as the passive result of the operations of the infinite, and on the other hand, the finite as the active product, no longer simply a passive result, but an active product of operations in the infinite. And that gives us the work, whereas the passive result of operations in the infinite gives us the waste product. So with that in mind, he's able to categorize the era of the 19th century and what was influenced by the 19th century, which is the program of romanticism. And that's any type of thought or action that is content to passively receive the infinite in its procedures of revolution or art or love or maybe science, just a passive reception. Whereas for Badiou, we need an active extortion or extraction of a new finitude, unknown finitude, from the infinite operations. So how are we going to do that? There's a question of method that comes up, and Badiou, I think, is quite clear in distinguishing the method in general and the method in his particular case, or in the particular specific case of this book. The method in the general case is Long March, where radical novelties, singularly mathematics and concerning the infinite, convoke us, summon us to finish with the destiny of finitude and to become the subjects of some truths. Okay, everything depends on this word singularly. You can interpret it as notably in this case, or you can interpret it in a stronger form as, that is to say, identically. And if you interpret it in that second way, you're going to get a hegemony of the mathematical truth procedure. And that's something that I just reject. I think that has to be set up according to the principle of equality from the beginning. Mathematics is of heuristic importance for particular persons, or for a particular societal context where algorithms and calculation are taking over the world. Okay, but it's not the only source of the truths in which we participate as subjects. And that's what we need. We need to get out of the finitist trap to become subjects of some truths, which truths will depend on the context and on the subjects involved. Then he goes, and I think here is where he makes it specific. The trajectory of this book is going to go from the critique of finitude through the investigation of the concrete emergence of certain infinites in the procedures of truth, of which human thought has shown itself to be capable. Okay, that's the general thesis again. So it's a concrete emergence of infinites in one of the procedures of truth. So we get the concrete universal. It's concrete, and it's the emergence of infinites in truth procedures. And we get the idea of the exception because it's emergence. So there are the constraints of the world. There are the constraints of knowledge, the constraints of art as canonically practiced. There are the constraints of political organizations. There are the constraints of the particular psychoanalytic apparatus, or the particular conjugal apparatus in which we live, in which we are contained. And there's the emergence, the anomalous, exceptional arising of truths and our participation in truths. And he says that this trajectory, and I'm interpreting that as him explaining his concrete and so universal trajectory in this book. The trajectory passes by a speculative theory as complete as possible of the kingdom of the infinites, such as contemporary mathematics gives us the keys. So once we've got the keys, we open the doors. And if we've had trouble before, it would be wise to leave the doors open, throw open all the doors, throw open all the doors in politics, in subjectivity and love, in art and in knowledge. And okay, thanks mathematics for giving us the keys, but don't expect to be the doorkeeper and tax us every time we go through one of the doors. They're not your doors. And if we didn't have your keys, we would have found other keys, or we would have, with a little luck or with help from others, we would have battered down the doors, or just at the right time the doors would fling themselves open. So anyhow, thanks mathematics, but don't get uppity. And it's after this that Badiou describes, or now redescribes, his own trajectory. And this sets up, for me, a problem of interpretation of Badiou's evolution, because he's going to talk about his 4 great books: Theory of the Subject, Being an Event, Logics of Worlds, and this one, The Immanence of Truths. And that throws up the question of what is the status of theory of the subject. And some people think that book's really great, and it's really, maybe according to some, maybe it's his best work, and that sort of gives us the best perspective, or a very important perspective, on the rest of the books. I reject that interpretation, and I'll say why. But I think the theory of the subject, well, it's important because he brings back the subject, which had been evinced by over de-absolutization as found in structuralism, and that's something he acquires, conceptually speaking, in that book, and that he continues, although he keeps redefining it. But there's a big problem for me with theory of the subject, and there's a big rupture. Obviously, it's not part of the Infinity Saga of the 3 other books. But anyhow, he describes the sort of context for the theory of the subject, where he says it was his first balance sheet. And we should be sensitive to words. His other books are not balance sheets. There's a retroactive connotation in the word balance sheet. So it's the first balance sheet of his exit from existentialism. He describes the context of what he went through between 1956 1966, structuralism, Levi-Strauss, Saussure. I've counted 6 points of effervescence that entered into theory of the subject: structuralism, psychoanalysis, Freud, and in particular Lacan, contemporary mathematics, a love for Plato that he shared with others at that time and has continued up to today. He plunged himself into poetry, to the novel and the theatre, so into writing, and he explored how writing can explain and describe his trajectory from Sartre to structuralism. And decisive for him was May 68, and so politics. And he says that all that was a mental and vital chaos. So that's the context for the book, Theory of the Subject. And he brought all that together under what he calls his primordial concern, one can think of Tillich, ultimate concern, or we can think of Foucault, because it's souci primordial. So you could translate it as primordial care. And in this primordial care was the practical service of the renewed communist idea. So it's the service of the idea of equality. And here I think we must be sensitive to the vocabulary and to what has been said before. He calls this book, Theory of the Subject, a synthetic figure. So it's a book of synthesis, like he said, a balance sheet. It's combining all these currents and giving them the most radical, intense, philosophical form he can. Sort of like Laruelle. So this is before the leap for me. As Laruelle said in his books of the 70s, it was he took the most radical thoughts and he synthesized them. So the method is synthesis, as with Badiou, of the most radical, and the synthesis itself radicalizes them even further. And he says that once again, he repeats the word bilan, balance sheet. So theory of the subject was a balance sheet and a synthesis. Quelque peu romantique, rather romantic. So he's already talked about romanticism a couple of pages before. And romanticism for him is the passive reception of the infinite. So if words have a sense, that means that this book, well, it's fairly romantic, or quite romantic, so it's not entirely romantic. So insofar as it's romantic, it's a passive reception of the infinites that are at work in the 6 points of effervescence, and it's not yet the active, so it's a passive result, which is a good way of describing a synthesis. There's a creative aspect to a synthesis, but overall it's a passive result, a passive reception of the infinite in Badiou's language. And so the active forces are to be seen in beginning with being an event. And I'll go even further than Badiou. He says it's a synthesis. He says that it's romantic. He says, by implication, that it's passive. I want to, because Badiou has talked about Lyotard as falling into reaction, I want to quote from the theory of the subject, where he distinguishes dialectics, which states that there is two, from metaphysics, which posits the multiple. And according to Badiou at this time, if you posit the multiple, you automatically posit the one. So he doesn't have the concept of the multiple without one at that moment. So for the thought of the multiple, the two, or dialectics, is the impairment of the multiple. The presupposed one of the multiple only has the effect of the integral infinite multiplicity, the infinity of infinities. So that's metaphysics for him. Multiplicity, integral, infinite multiplicity, the infinity of infinities. And it is at this price that the Cartesian problematic of the subject can be made to disappear. So, for me, that's a thesis that Badiou has to break with in order to launch the Infinity Trilogy. So, after all this creative ferment of the late 50s and the 60s and the 70s, because Theory of the Subject was published in 1982, there is a halting point, a reception of these infinities, and a synthesis of them, but it's still a form of reaction against the multiplicities and the infinity of infinities. After that, we're on more familiar territory. He sums up being an event where the subject is constrained by the formal rules of the subjacent ontology, except there's an exception to this constraint that takes the form of a non-calculable origin, of a local rupture that I call an event. So once again, the universals that apply within the finite are universals of constraint. They seem like they apply at all times, everywhere, to everyone, with no exception, but in fact, truths show us by means of the exception and as exceptions that there is more than the finite and the calculable. Then with logics of worlds, he says, I think that's interesting, I knew that this generality did not exhaust the difficulties and the constraints to which truths are subject in the tissue of the situations for which they proceed. So once again, he's tying constraints to the situations and to the worlds. He says, I had the revelation of a totally new mode of approach to these constraints, and thus to a totally new approach to what a particular world is, when Jean Toussaint de Sainty told me that alongside set theory, there was category theory, which gave a different type of ontology, no longer the compactness of multiplicities, but the moving network of relations. So I think it's interesting that he uses the word revelation, because we talked about the idea of a necessary conversion experience, which may have psychological and social instantiations, but it's an essential philosophical experience. It's the essential way of participating in truths. You need conversions, you need revelations in a non-onto-theological sense. Suddenly a whole new world, or more than a world in Badiou's sense of logics of world, suddenly a whole new paradigm opens up before you. And he had this revelation in dialogue with de Sainty. So this trilogy is not a homogeneous block. Already somewhere, he doesn't say where, between theory of the subject and being an event, he must have had a revelation and a conversion, because the perspective on the infinity of infinities and the multiplicities is just totally transformed. Then, after being an event, he has another revelation and a conversion. It doesn't change the fundamental analysis of the generic infinites, but it is a highly intense, it's infinitely intense, if you want, transformation of perspective. And that's what leads him to investigate the inscription of the infinite within particular worlds, and of truths within the worlds. Then there's another radical reorientation when he decides to start with the exception and see how a world is worked over by, is it a descent? By the action of these truths within the worlds. And that is the way out of the reign of the transcendence or of the one, that he made it his duty to guarantee against the dominant relativism. So I talked about tests in the last section. That's another test. If, given the hegemony of the ideology of democratic relativism, if he can establish in even one truth procedure the existence of absolutes, and he can transpose that into the other truth procedures as well and give poetized or philosophized transposition of that as well. If he can just do that, then he has validated his theory of truths, and that is what he's going to employ this book to do. So he says, now to sum up, he's doing a lot of summing up in this introduction, but I think it's very dense, and as once you've read the book, you see it as even more dense than you thought. So once we have clarified the foundations of oppression by finitude, remember, clarified is based on clarity, and we said clarity in Badiou is Popperian style clarity. You explain and clarify the known by the unknown, the finite by the infinite. So once we've clarified the foundations of oppression by finitude, once we've thought through the astonishing hierarchy of types of infinity, and once we have examined in the dialectical division of the finite, that is to say between works and waste products, once we have examined the genesis of what deserves to be called a work, perhaps then we can think that, or we can think in what consists truths conceived no longer in their being, as in being an event, or in their appearing, as in logics of worlds, but in their real subsistence, in their permanent possibility of mobilizing their effects. So this comes close to what Deleuze said in Theory of Sense about sense. Sense insists. It doesn't exist or appear. It insists. And elsewhere, in Metaphysics of Real Happiness, Badiou says that now that he's got the idea of truths with a capital T and some experience with them, he can see what corresponds to that concept in other philosophers, and he says that sense in Deleuze corresponds to truth in his work. So we have we're no longer talking about truths in their being or in their appearing, but in their subsistence, their real subsistence, as permanent possibility of mobilizing their effects. So it's a permanent possibility. That's the untimeliness, which is eternal and universal. It's a possibility of mobilizing the effects. It doesn't constrain us. The constraints, the universal constraints, are the constraints of finitude. It's a universal possibility of mobilizing, a universal availability for producing new effects. So that's the big question. What is the consistence of truths as works? That is to say, as singular acting or active forces that are, despite finite, that bear witness to the absolute. So this idea of bearing witness, once again, is a callback to Lyotard, where we're meant to bear witness to the different, that all is not flat and smooth and chewing gummy, thinly stretched, to repeat the similar description of Badiou, that we must bear witness to the different, including this infinite prescription and this authority of the infinite. So despite rejecting the limitations, in fact, of Lyotard's appeal to an authority of the infinite, because he limits it just to prescription and not to ontological description, forgetting these limitations, there is this point of convergence between Badiou and Lyotard that he declares and that he reaffirms here just by the use of the word of bearing witness. So these are the questions. What's going on with truths as works, and what's going on with truths and subjects that are seized beyond the structural forms of their being and the historico-existential forms of their appearing in the irreversible absoluteness of their action, in the infinite destiny of their finite work. Okay, so the problem is, how are we going to deal with the fact that the finite is only a result or a product, but we're surrounded by the finite? So we have to find, this is the criterion of immanence, we have to find within the finite the traces, the points, the bearing witnesses to the absolute infinity of their action. So such are the questions to which, immodest as I am, I think that this book brings several rational answers. So I think this does have more general import. I think that it is saying, in fact, it's legitimating, uh, retroactively in this case, Laruel's procedure as well, although perhaps saying that Laruel didn't go far enough. It's legitimating the idea that we make an absolute speculative leap, and the speculation is something concrete and existential. So speculation can exist in love, and so that means in everyday life, because I don't want to sound too romantic in saying love is all around us, but and in politics, and that's all around us in everyday life too, as well as in the seemingly more rarefied, more elitist procedures of art and science or mathematics. And even there, art is the domain of what is technically a work of art, but all these truth procedures, including love and politics, are procedures where we are capable of bearing witness to the infinite in the finite, and not just bearing witness passively, but by this bearing witness, being able to produce works that have truth effects within the finite world.